The day my mother told me to leave her house, she was holding my mail like it was trash she'd finally decided to throw out. I remember thinking how calm her voice was. People are always calm right before they make the wrong choice. She stood in the kitchen of the house I had helped pay for over the last 3 years, her thumb tracing the edge of an envelope from the firm. It was already open. Privacy was a concept Paula Reed only applied to herself. "Lucas," she said, her voice sliding into that high, nasal register she used for being disappointed. "This came today. It looks official. It looks final." She slid the letter across the granite island. The logo of Miller and Associates sat at the top, crisp and authoritative. Below it, the text was a masterpiece of corporate erasure. My employment as a junior architect had been terminated, effective immediately, due to significant structural discrepancies in the Grayson project. Discrepancies I hadn't authored, but which bore my digital signature. I didn't reach for the paper. I knew what it said. I'd spent the last 8 hours sitting in a park across from the office, watching Ethan Brooks walk out to his car with a celebratory bounce in his step. Ethan, who couldn't design a functional birdhouse without a template, had successfully convinced the senior partners that I was the one who had miscalculated the load-bearing requirements for the North Wing. "I didn't do it, Ma," I said. I kept my voice flat. Anger is a gift you give people, and I wasn't feeling generous. "The paper says you did," she replied, folding her arms. She was wearing her catering uniform, stark white, professional, ironed to a sharp edge. She lived for the image of the hard-working widow, the pillar of the community who had raised a son on her own. A son who was now, apparently, a failure. "And honestly, I'm not surprised. You've been distracted, you've been moody. It was only a matter of time before you got sloppy." She didn't ask how I was going to pay my share of the mortgage. She didn't ask if I had a lawyer. She just looked at me with a peculiar kind of hunger, the kind that comes from finally having a reason to be the victim again. If I was a failure, she could be the long-suffering mother. That currency spent well in her social circles. "I need you out by Monday," she added. "I have a reputation to maintain, Lucas. I can't have a 30-year-old unemployed man living in my guest room while I'm hosting the garden club. It's a bad look. It's a heavy weight to carry." "I'm 27, I said. "See? This is what I mean. The attitude. The constant corrections." She turned back to the stove, where a pot of something expensive-smelling was simmering. "I've already told your Aunt Martha. She's devastated for me, truly." I looked at the back of her head. She had already rewritten the history of the last decade in her mind. My contributions were gone. My stability was a footnote. I was now a project she had failed to fix. I went to the office the next morning, not to beg, but to collect my desk. The lobby of Miller and Associates felt different when you didn't have a badge. It felt like a museum, cold, quiet, and full of things you weren't allowed to touch. Ethan was standing by the coffee machine when I walked in. He had a way of leaning against surfaces that suggested he owned them. Beside him was Caleb Morris, our mutual friend, or so I'd thought for 5 years. Caleb was looking at his shoes. He knew Ethan had accessed my terminal. He knew I'd been at the doctor's the afternoon the files were modified. But Caleb liked his paycheck, and he liked Ethan's invitations to the country club even more. "Hey, Luke," Ethan said, his voice dripping with a fake, oily sympathy. "Tough break. I told the partners we should give you a second chance, but you know how they are about the Grayson contract. Safety first, right?" "Right," I said. I started putting my drafting pens into a cardboard box. Safety first. "If you need a recommendation for something smaller, let me know," Ethan continued. "Maybe residential, something with less pressure. I've got some contacts in landscaping." Caleb finally looked up, his eyes darting to mine and then away. "Sorry, man," he muttered. It was the sound of a man who had already buried me and was just hoping I wouldn't haunt him. "Don't be sorry, Caleb," I said, clicking my briefcase shut. "Everything is exactly where it needs to be." Ethan laughed, a sharp barking sound. "That's the spirit. Delusional to the end. You always did have that weird calm about you. It's creepy, honestly. Most guys would be screaming right now." "Screaming doesn't change the blueprints," I said. I walked out past the senior partner's office. Mr. Henderson was looking through the glass. He didn't wave, but he didn't look away either. He looked at me with the clinical curiosity of a man watching a car crash. I gave him a slight nod. I had the HR records in my bag, the ones I'd quietly printed 2 days ago when I first smelled the smoke. They didn't prove Ethan did it, but they proved the procedural uncertainty of the investigation. The firm hadn't fired me for cause. They'd fired me to make the problem go away quickly. It was a subtle distinction, but in the world of contracts, subtlety is a lever. The next 3 days were a masterclass in social evaporation. By Saturday, word had traveled through Paula's phone tree. My cousins weren't returning texts. My old college roommates were suddenly very busy. It's amazing how fast the floor disappears when people think you're a sinking ship. On Sunday night, I sat in the living room. My boxes were stacked by the front door. Paula was sitting in her armchair, sipping tea and watching a documentary about English royalty. She acted like I was a ghost, a lingering scent she was waiting for the breeze to catch. "I'm leaving the key on the counter," I said. "Good," she replied, not looking up from the television. "I've already arranged for a locksmith to come tomorrow. Nothing personal, Lucas. It's just, after what happened at your firm, I have to be careful. Trust is earned, and you've spent yours. I paid half the property taxes last month, Paula. And consider that a gift to the mother who raised you. It's the least you could do after the stress you've put on my heart this week." She finally looked at me, her eyes hard and bright. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for. But don't come back here looking for a handout. I'm done being your safety net." I didn't tell her I had already secured a studio apartment across town using the last of my savings. I didn't tell her that Henderson had looked at my portfolio one last time before I left, and told me, off the record, that my work was superior to Ethan's. I didn't tell her anything. I picked up my boxes and walked to my car. The air was cool and smelled of damp pavement. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, watching the lights in the house. I watched Paula get up, lock the door, and turn off the porch light. She didn't even check to see if I'd pulled out of the driveway. I felt a strange, cold clarity. For years, I had been the one trying to hold things together. The job, the family, the reputation. I had been the one worrying about the load-bearing walls. But the house was already compromised. The rot was in the foundation. I pulled out my phone and looked at a photo I'd taken of a login sheet at the office. It showed Ethan's badge swiping into the server room at 11:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. I also looked at a screenshot of a text message Caleb had sent me months ago, bragging about how Ethan's father had donated to the firm's holiday gala. I wasn't going to use them yet. Revenge is like architecture. If you rush the pouring of the concrete, the whole thing cracks later. You have to wait for the right climate. You have to wait for the weight to be distributed just so. I drove away from the house, leaving the quiet suburb behind. I had no job, no family, and no house. Most people would call that a tragedy. I called it a clean site. I could build anything here. I checked into my new place, a small, echoing box on the 4th floor of a converted warehouse. It was perfect. I sat on the floor, my back against the wall, and listened to the city. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A voicemail from Paula. I didn't listen to it. I knew what it would be. More guilt, more curated outrage, more of her favorite story where she is the hero and I am the burden. I took out a notebook and wrote 3 names at the top of the first page. Paula, Ethan, Caleb. Underneath I wrote, Phase 1, Observation. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt like a machine designed to calculate the exact point where a structure fails. Ethan thought he had won because he was still in the building. Paula thought she had won because she had the house. They didn't realize that I was the one who knew how the buildings were put together, and more importantly, I knew how to take them apart. I closed the notebook and leaned my head back against the wall. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the most peaceful I had felt in years. People think the loudest person in the room has the power. They're wrong. The person with the power is the one who can afford to wait. I could wait. I had nothing but time and a very long memory. The studio apartment smelled like industrial cleaner and old dust, a combination that felt surprisingly honest. There were no decorative pillows chosen to impress neighbors, no framed photos of a family that didn't actually like each other, and no lingering scent of Paula's expensive catering appetizers. It was just a room. For the first week, I lived out of 2 suitcases and a cardboard box. I slept on a folding cot I'd bought from a surplus store, listening to the rhythmic hum of the freight elevator down the hall. Being an underdog isn't a cinematic experience. It's a series of logistical hurdles. When you lose your status, you realize how much of your identity is tied to plastic cards and digital permissions. I spent my mornings at a library 2 blocks away, using their high-speed internet to track the movements of Miller and Associates. I wasn't looking for a way back in. I was looking for the gaps in the floorboards. I observed how people treated me when I had no leverage. I went to a local architectural mixer, dressed in my best suit, and watched the eyes of former colleagues slide right over me. It was as if I had become translucent. They didn't see Lucas Reed, the promising architect. They saw a cautionary tale. I stood by the buffet, nursing a single ginger ale, and watched Caleb Morris holding court in the center of the room. He was laughing, his hand on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan looked triumphant, wearing a watch that probably cost 2 months of my previous salary. I didn't approach them, I just watched. I noticed how Caleb's smile didn't reach his eyes when Ethan made a joke at my expense. Caleb was a self-preservationist. He wasn't evil, he was just weak. Weakness is often more dangerous than malice because it's unpredictable. The psychological freefall I expected never quite arrived. Instead, I felt a heavy, cold weight settling in my chest, a ballast that kept me upright while everything else drifted away. I began the process of securing my records. I sent a formal, clipped email to the HR department at Miller & Associates, requesting a full copy of my personnel file and the internal memo regarding the Grayson project. The response came 48 hours later. It was signed by a junior administrator I didn't know. The tone was dismissive but legally careful. They attached the documents, including the final termination report. I scanned it line by line. There it was. The official reason wasn't gross negligence or malpractice. It was procedural uncertainty resulting in a loss of confidence. They had blinked. They didn't have enough proof to label me a fraud, so they'd chosen a vague exit strategy to protect themselves from a potential lawsuit. It was a neutral reference disguised as a door slammed in my face. I saved 3 copies of that file. While I worked, my phone became a repository for Paula's mounting hysteria. She had realized within 72 hours of my departure that she no longer had a live-in audience or a secondary source of mortgage payments. Her first few voicemails were instructional, reminding me where I'd left my winter coat, telling me she'd moved my remaining boxes to the porch. Then the tone shifted. "Lucas, it's your mother," the 4th message began. Her voice had that practiced tremor she used when she wanted people to think she'd been crying. I had a very difficult conversation with the bank today. They were asking about the payment schedule. It's very embarrassing to have to explain that my son has simply walked away. I don't think you realize the strain this puts on a woman in my position. I deleted it. I deleted the next one too, where she accused me of stealing a set of silver spoons that I knew were sitting in her sideboard. She was building a narrative for her friends, a story of a mother abandoned by an ungrateful, unstable son. She was rewriting the script to make sure that even in my absence, I was the villain. I spent my afternoons walking the city, mapping out the properties Miller & Associates currently had under construction. I looked at the site fences, the permits, and the names of the contractors. I was gathering a different kind of architectural knowledge. I was learning the pressure points of the local industry. One afternoon, I sat in a coffee shop across from a new residential development Ethan was supposedly overseeing. I watched him pull up in his polished SUV. He spent 20 minutes on his phone before even getting out of the car. When he finally walked onto the site, he didn't look at the structural steel or the foundation work. He went straight to the site manager's trailer. He was a man of optics, not of substance. He relied on the fact that the people above him were too busy to check his math, and the people below him were too tired to care. I redirected my mail to a P.O. box and spent my evenings eating cold sandwiches and studying the Grayson blueprints I'd kept on a thumb drive. I found the error again. It was so simple, so deliberate. A decimal point shifted in the load calculations for the cantilevered balcony. It was the kind of mistake a tired man makes, or a man who knows exactly how to make it look like someone else was tired. At the 10,000 character mark of my new life, I received a notification from a neutral industry contact. It was a confirmation that my termination had been officially logged in the regional professional database as a voluntary separation under mutual agreement. The firm had covered their tracks, but in doing so, they had given me a clean slate. I wasn't a pariah, I was just another architect in between projects. The realization hit me with a jolt of dry irony. They thought they were doing me a favor by not destroying me completely, unaware that they were leaving the door unlocked. I went to a small, independent firm on the edge of the city. It was run by a woman named Sarah Jenkins, who had a reputation for hiring based on talent rather than pedigree. She looked at my portfolio for a long time. She looked at the Grayson designs, the original ones, before Ethan had touched them. "This is good work, Lucas," she said, her voice gravelly from years of site inspections and too much caffeine. "I heard you had a disagreement with the partners at Miller." "We had a difference in philosophy regarding structural integrity," I said. "It wasn't a lie." "I bet you did," she said, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "They like things fast and flashy. I like things that stay standing for 50 years. I can't pay you what they did, but you'll have your own projects. And I don't care about your mother's catering reputation or who you have lunch with." "I'm not looking for lunch," I said. "I'm looking for a desk." I started the next day. The work was grueling, and the hours were long, but it was honest. I felt my grip on reality tightening. I was no longer the man being shoved out of his own life. I was the man building a new one in the shadows. Paula's calls continued, escalating into a bizarre mix of insults and demands. She had moved on from the mortgage to the social consequences of my departure. Everyone is asking where you are, Lucas, she hissed into the receiver one Tuesday night. I had to tell them you've taken a leave of absence for your health. It's the only way to save face. Do you have any idea how it feels to have to lie for your own child? You're a burden, even when you aren't here. You owe me for the years I spent making sure you had a roof over your head. You're a selfish, hollow person. I sat in my dark studio, the blue light of my laptop, the only illumination, and listened to her voice. It didn't hurt anymore. It was just noise, like the sound of a failing HVAC system in an old building. You don't get angry at the machine. You just realize it needs to be replaced. I began to document everything. I kept a log of her calls. I saved the emails from Ethan. I even began to quietly reach out to old contacts, not to ask for favors, but to verify things. I found out that Ethan had been taking credit for my designs on 2 other minor projects. I found out that Paula had used my name to secure a line of credit for her business 3 years ago, a line of credit I had never authorized, but which bore a signature that looked remarkably like mine. The pieces were starting to align. The betrayal wasn't a single event. It was a structure that had been built around me over years of small, quiet thefts and minor cruelties. I had been the support beam for a house that was designed to collapse on me. One evening, I saw Caleb in a grocery store. He tried to turn down another aisle, but I was already there, pushing my cart toward the cereal. He looked trapped, his eyes darting toward the exit. "Lucas," he said, his voice thin. "I didn't know you were still in the city." "I live here, Caleb," I said. I looked at him, really looked at him, until he started to fidget with the collar of his shirt. "I'm working again. A small firm. We do good work." That's great, really. Look, about what happened, I wanted to say something, but Ethan has a lot of influence with the partners, and I couldn't risk my position." "I know," I said. I gave him a small, tight smile. "I understand exactly who you are." He flinched as if I'd slapped him. "It wasn't personal." "Everything is personal, Caleb. You just haven't realized it yet." I walked away, leaving him standing there in the middle of the aisle. I felt a surge of cold, focused energy. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was preparing. I went back to my studio and opened my notebook. I looked at the 3 names. The build-up was almost complete. The foundation was set. I had my job, I had my proof, and I had my silence. People like Paula and Ethan depend on the noise. They depend on the emotional reactions of their victims to hide their own tracks. But when the victim stops reacting, the architecture of their lies begins to groan under its own weight. I looked at the confirmation I'd received earlier that afternoon. My firing was officially marked as procedural uncertainty. It was the final piece of the permit. I was now a free agent in a world that thought I was broken. I picked up a pen and began to sketch. Not a building, but a timeline. A sequence of events that would lead back to the front door of the house I had helped pay for, and the office where I had been erased. I didn't need a weapon. I just needed the truth, delivered with the same cold, structural precision they had used against me. The silence in the studio was no longer empty. It was full of the future. I closed the notebook and turned off the light. Tomorrow, the rebuild would begin in earnest. And this time, I was the only one who knew where the load-bearing walls were hidden. The new firm was located in a renovated brick warehouse where the windows were drafted and the heating was temperamental, but the drafting tables were solid oak. Sarah Jenkins didn't believe in open-concept offices or glass partitions that allowed partners to hover over your shoulder. She believed in results. My new routine became a clockwork of necessity. 4 miles of walking a day to save on transit, 12 hours at the desk, and 6 hours of sleep. The physical exhaustion was a luxury. It acted as a buffer against the noise of the past, a hum that kept my mind occupied with stresses that were productive rather than corrosive. By the 2nd month at Jenkins & Associates, I was no longer the new guy with a clouded history. I was the architect who caught the grading error on the Riverside project before the concrete was poured. I was the one who found a way to shave 15% off the material costs of a low-income housing complex without sacrificing the aesthetic integrity. My confidence didn't come back in a rush. It grew slowly, like the strength in a limb that had been in a cast for too long. I stopped looking at the floor when I walked through the lobby. I started wearing my shirts pressed again. I was rebuilding the exterior of Lucas Reed, making sure the facade was impenetrable. Meanwhile, Paula's attempts to reach me had reached a state of frantic consistency. My phone was a graveyard of missed calls and notifications. I had silenced her number, but I hadn't blocked it. I needed the records. I needed to see the progression of her narrative. It shifted from insults to guilt, and then, most interestingly, to a strange kind of desperation. "Lucas, the faucet in the kitchen is leaking," she said in a message left at 3 a.m. Her voice was thin, stripped of its usual performative vibrance. I called a plumber, and he quoted me $300 just to look at it. I don't have that kind of money right now. You know how the catering business slows down in the winter. It's very cold in this house alone. It would be so easy for you to just come by and fix it. I won't even mention the firm. We can just be mother and son again." I played the message while sitting at my small desk in the studio, eating a bowl of plain rice. I didn't feel a flicker of sympathy. I knew that faucet. I had replaced the washer 6 months ago. It wasn't leaking. She was testing the perimeter, looking for a soft spot in my resolve. She wanted the free labor and the emotional punching bag back in the guest room. More than that, she wanted the image of the reconciled family to present to her friends. I began to gather my leverage with the same meticulous care I applied to a site survey. I visited the local records office on my lunch breaks. I discovered that the line of credit Paula had opened using my name was tied to a joint account she'd never closed after my father's passing. She had used my credit score to float her business through 3 bad quarters, all while telling me that I was a financial burden on her. It was a clean, documentable fraud. I didn't take it to the police. Not yet. A legal case is a sledgehammer. I was looking for a scalpel. Ethan's career, by contrast, seemed to be thriving on the surface. He had been promoted to senior associate at Miller, likely as a reward for fixing the Grayson mess he had actually created. I saw his name mentioned in a trade journal regarding a new luxury high-rise. He looked smug in the headshot, his jaw set in a way that suggested unearned authority. But I knew the contractors he worked with. I knew the corners he liked to cut. I started a digital folder on my private drive. It wasn't full of gossip. It was full of permit dates, change orders, and inspector notes. Ethan was a creature of momentum, and people who rely on momentum eventually forget to check the brakes. Caleb remained the weak link. He continued to avoid me, but he couldn't avoid the industry. At a building permit hearing at City Hall, I found myself standing 3 people behind him in the queue. He was sweating despite the air conditioning. When he finally realized I was there, he nearly dropped his blueprints. "Lucas," he whispered, looking around to see if anyone from Miller was nearby. "You're looking good." "I am good, Caleb," I said. My voice was pitched just loud enough to be heard by the people around us. Sarah Jenkins treats her staff with a lot of transparency. It's refreshing. You should try it sometime. "Look, Ethan is..." "He's been talking," Caleb said, his voice dropping even lower. "He's telling people you've had a breakdown, that you're not even in the industry anymore. He's making sure your name stays off the short lists for the big civic projects." "Let him talk," I said. I stepped closer to him, moving into his personal space just enough to make him lean back. I didn't touch him. I didn't raise my hand. I just stood there, a solid, unmoving presence. The thing about stories, Caleb, is that they have to be consistent. If the story changes, people start looking at the storyteller instead of the subject. Remind Ethan of that, would you? Caleb nodded quickly and bolted as soon as his paperwork was stamped. I watched him go. He was the messenger I needed. He would go straight back to Ethan and tell him I wasn't broken. He would tell him I was calm. And for a man like Ethan, who built his power on the perceived weakness of others, my lack of anger would be more terrifying than a shouting match. The tension reached a new peak on a Thursday evening. I was leaving the firm when I saw a familiar silver SUV idling by the curb. Ethan was leaning against the driver's side door, his sunglasses perched on top of his head, even though the sun was already behind the buildings. He wanted to look like he was in control, but his grip on his phone was white-knuckled. "Reed," he called out as I approached the sidewalk. "We need to have a chat." I didn't stop. I kept walking toward the subway entrance. "I don't think we have anything to say to each other, Ethan, unless you're here to discuss the load-bearing errors on the Grayson wing." He caught up to me, his pace hurried and uneven. "Listen to me. I heard you're whispering to people at City Hall. I heard you're looking into the credit files. You need to stop. You're out, okay? You lost. Don't make this more difficult for yourself than it already is." I stopped then. I turned to face him in the middle of the crowded sidewalk. I didn't look angry. I looked bored. I stood tall, using my height to look down at him, forcing him to crane his neck slightly. "I'm not making anything difficult, Ethan," I said, my voice low and steady. "I'm just an architect looking at the foundations. If the foundation is solid, you have nothing to worry about. But if you've built your career on a fault line, well, that's just poor design. I could have you blacklisted from every firm in the state," he hissed, his face reddening. "You already tried that," I replied. "And yet, here I am, working, building, while you're standing on a public street shaking because a broken man is asking questions. Who looks like they're having a breakdown right now, Ethan? Is it me?" He stepped back, his mouth hanging open slightly. He looked for a moment like he wanted to swing at me, but the presence of dozens of witnesses and my own unwavering stare stopped him. He climbed back into his SUV and sped off, the tires screeching against the asphalt. It was a loud, desperate exit. I went home and checked my messages. There was a new one from Paula. Her tone had shifted again. The guilt had been replaced by a sharp, biting coldness. "I saw Ethan's father at the club today," she said. "He told me you've been harassing his son. He said you're making threats. I won't have it, Lucas. I won't have my name dragged through the mud because you can't accept your own failures. I'm giving you one last chance to apologize to them and move on. If you don't, I'm going to tell everyone about the money you borrowed from the business account. I'll make sure everyone knows you're a thief as well as a failure." I sat in the silence of my studio, a small dry laugh escaping my throat. She was threatening to expose the very crime she had committed. She had lived in her own curated reality for so long that she genuinely believed she could rewrite the laws of the land as easily as she rewrote the family history. But I had the confirmation I'd been waiting for. I'd spent the last hour before leaving the office reviewing a series of emails I'd recovered from a blind carbon copy thread. They were between Ethan and a subcontractor. In them, Ethan explicitly asked for the Grayson records to be adjusted to reflect my login ID. He had even offered a kickback from his bonus. Then I saw something I hadn't expected. There was a third person on the thread, someone who had been BCC'd on every exchange. It was Paula. She hadn't just stood by while I was betrayed. She had coordinated with Ethan to ensure I was pushed out. She had wanted me back in the house, under her thumb, dependent on her for my survival. She had sacrificed my career to satisfy her own need for control. She had used Ethan to break me so she could fix me. The realization didn't make me scream. It didn't make me want to break things. It just made me feel very, very cold. The architecture of the betrayal was finally clear. It was a three-point structure. Ethan wanted the status, Caleb wanted the safety, and Paula wanted the possession. I looked at the notebook on my desk. The names were still there. Phase 2, preparation for impact, was over. I began to draft a series of emails. One to the state licensing board, one to the senior partner at Miller & Associates, and one to the catering board that oversaw Paula's professional certification. I wasn't going to send them yet. I needed one more thing. I needed to see them all together. I needed them to see the structure fall in real time. I checked the community calendar. The annual Founders Gala was in 3 weeks. Paula was catering it. Ethan was on the committee. Caleb would be there to hold their coats. I closed my laptop and stood up. I went to the window and looked out at the city. The lights were bright, sharp, and cold. For the first time since the day I left the house, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The precision of a collapse is rarely about the force of the final blow. It is about the removal of the specific supports that hold the weight. I spent the following 2 weeks acting as a silent auditor of my own life. At Jenkins & Associates, I was given the lead on a restoration project for an old library downtown. It required me to dig through archives, looking at the original vellum drawings from 1920 to understand why the east wall was bowing. It was a perfect metaphor for my current state of mind. To fix the present, you have to find the point where the original builder lied. I spent my evenings documenting Paula's communications. She had moved past the phase of cold threats and into a more frantic, public-facing campaign. She began posting on social media vague, poetic paragraphs about the burden of silence and the pain of a mother's forgotten sacrifices. She was fishing for the sympathy that acted as her social oxygen. I watched the comments roll in from her catering clients and the local bridge club. They offered her digital hugs and whispered about how brave she was to deal with such a difficult son. She was building a wall of public opinion, unaware that I was already underneath it with a chisel. I systematically compiled the evidence of her financial irregularities. The line of credit she had opened in my name was the anchor. I visited the bank in person, presenting my identification and requesting a full audit of the joint account she had used. The clerk, a woman who looked like she'd seen 1,000 small-town betrayals, handed over the records with a sympathetic wince. Paula hadn't just used the money for her business. She'd used it to maintain the illusion of wealth, club memberships, high-end kitchen upgrades, and anonymous donations to the local arts council that were always whispered about in her circles. It was a paper trail of vanity. Then there was the matter of Ethan's leverage. I knew that Ethan's father, a man with significant political ties in the city, was the only reason Miller & Associates hadn't looked closer at the Grayson errors. The firm didn't want to lose the elder Brooks's influence. But influence is a fickle thing. It only works as long as the person holding it isn't a liability. I began to look into the lease clauses of the shared storage unit Paula used for her catering business. It was a facility owned by a subsidiary of the firm I now worked for. The paperwork was old, but the terms were clear. The unit was in my name, signed for during a period when I was trying to help her expand. She had been paying the monthly fee from the joint account, but the legal right of access belonged to me. I timed my first move for a Tuesday morning, the peak of her preparation for a high-profile fundraiser. I knew she had 3 industrial ovens and 500 pounds of specialty glassware stored in that unit. I drove to the facility, showed the manager my ID and the original lease agreement, and requested a lock change. No shouting, no drama. I simply told the manager I was consolidating assets due to a family restructuring. Within 20 minutes, the old padlocks were cut and replaced with high-grade steel cylinders. I kept the keys. The first call came an hour later. I didn't answer. I watched the phone buzz on my drafting table. Then came the texts. "Lucas, what have you done? I can't get into the unit. I have the mayor's lunch tomorrow. Open this door immediately." I let the messages pile up until they reached a fever pitch. I wasn't doing it to be cruel. I was doing it to test her reaction time. She didn't call the police. She couldn't. To call the police would mean explaining why her son, whom she had told everyone was unwell and away on a retreat, was actually in town and locking her out of a unit she'd been using under his name. She was trapped by her own fiction. I finally sent a single reply. "The unit is secured. We will discuss the contents and the joint account on the night of the Founders' Gala. Not before." The silence from her end after that was absolute. It was the silence of someone realizing that the person they were hunting had stopped running and started setting traps. Meanwhile, Caleb Morris made one last attempt to bridge the gap. He caught me outside a hardware store on a Saturday morning. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His tie was crooked, and there was a frantic energy in his movements that made people on the sidewalk give him a wide berth. "Lucas, wait," he said, grabbing my arm. I looked down at his hand until he let go, his fingers twitching. "You have to stop. Ethan is losing his mind. He's talking about filing a harassment suit. He thinks you're following him." "I don't need to follow him, Caleb," I said, adjusting the bag of supplies on my shoulder. "I know exactly where he's going. He's going to the same place everyone goes when they build on sand." "He told me about the emails," Caleb whispered, his voice cracking. "He said you found the thread with your mother. Lucas, I swear, I didn't know she was involved. I thought it was just between us and the subcontractor. I didn't think he'd bring your family into it." "But you still stayed silent," I said. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a calm, conversational tone. "You knew the truth the day I was fired. You watched me pack my desk. You knew my mother was helping him erase my career, and you chose to go to the country club with them instead. You chose the shade over the sun, Caleb. Now you have to deal with the cold." "He's going to ruin me too," Caleb said, his eyes welling with a self-pitying moisture. "He says if he goes down, he's taking everyone who knew about the Grayson file with him. Please, just give me the drive. I can make it right. I can talk to Henderson." "You had 6 months to talk to Henderson," I said. "The window for making it right closed the moment I left the building. Now we're just discussing the consequences." I walked away, leaving him standing there. I felt a strange sense of detachment. I wasn't the man I had been. That man had been full of hope and a desperate need to be liked. This new version of Lucas Reed was a creature of logic and geometry. I saw the world in terms of stresses and strains, of points of failure and structural integrity. I spent the final week before the gala preparing the physical evidence. I printed the email threads, the ones showing Paula's coordination with Ethan. I printed the bank statements showing the unauthorized line of credit. I even gathered the original Grayson blueprints and overlaid them with Ethan's corrected versions, highlighting the deliberate errors in bright neon red. It was a beautiful set of documents. It was a narrative that couldn't be argued with, a sequence of facts that were as undeniable as gravity. I also did my homework on the venue. The Founders' Gala was being held at the Grand Atrium, a building I knew well. I knew the service entrances, the layout of the catering kitchen, and the location of the VIP lounge. I knew where the shadows were. On the night before the event, I received one final voicemail from Paula. Her voice was different, calm, almost sweet. It was the voice she used when she was about to deliver the most devastating blow. "I spoke to Caleb, Lucas," she said. "He told me you're planning something for tomorrow. I want you to think very carefully about what you're doing. If you embarrass me in front of this city, I will make sure you never work in this state again. I have friends in the licensing board, and I have the records of your instability from the firm. I've already drafted a letter to the board. I'll send it the moment you step foot in that atrium. Stay in your little room, Lucas. It's for the best." I deleted the message. I didn't feel fear. I felt the same anticipation an architect feels when the scaffolding is finally removed. You want to see if the building stands on its own. I looked at my suit, hanging on the back of the door. It was a sharp charcoal gray. It was the suit of a man who belonged in a room full of power. I checked the keys to the storage unit in my pocket. I checked the flash drive in my wallet. The preparation was over. The structure was primed. All that was left was to walk into the room and let the weight of their own choices do the work. I thought about the storage unit, full of the glassware and ovens Paula needed for her triumph tomorrow. I thought about the emails sitting in my outbox, scheduled to send to the entire board of Miller and Associates at exactly 9:12 p.m. I realized then that Caleb had tried to apologize not because he felt bad for me, but because he realized I was the only person in the room who wasn't afraid. And in a world built on image and secrets, a man with nothing to lose and a briefcase full of truth is the most dangerous element in the room. I turned off the lights and went to sleep. I slept deeply, without dreams. The next day wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. It was about putting the decimal points back where they belonged. The grand atrium was a cathedral of glass and polished limestone, designed to make everyone inside feel both significant and small. It was the kind of space where a whisper could carry if you knew how to use the acoustics. I arrived at 8:00 p.m., not through the service entrance, but through the front doors, handing my invitation to the attendant with a steady hand. I had sent one message to Paula an hour before, a PDF of my new offer letter from Jenkins and Associates, a summary of the unauthorized credit lines she had opened, and a formal cease contact notice drafted by a legal clinic. I didn't wait for a reply. I knew she was currently in the thick of the event, trying to manage a catering crisis without the equipment I had locked away. The room was a sea of black ties and silk gowns. I saw Ethan Brooks almost immediately. He was standing near the champagne tower, surrounded by a group of junior associates who were hanging on his every word. He looked like the picture of success, but as I moved closer, I could see the hairline fractures in his composure. He was checking his watch every 30 seconds. He was looking at the entrance every time the doors swung open. When his eyes finally landed on me, he didn't move. He froze, the glass in his hand tilting dangerously to one side. I didn't head for him first. I moved toward the VIP lounge, where the senior partners of Miller and Associates were gathered. I saw Mr. Henderson standing by a marble pillar, looking over a program. I approached him with the same calm I used when presenting a site plan. "Good evening, Mr. Henderson," I said. He looked up, squinting through his spectacles. "Reed, I heard you'd moved on to other things? Some health issues I believe your mother mentioned?" "My health is excellent," I said, my voice carrying just enough to reach the two other partners nearby. "I've actually spent the last few months at Jenkins and Associates. We're handling the restoration of the Central Library. I'm the lead on the structural phase." Henderson's eyebrows shot up. The library was a prestigious contract, one Miller had lost the bid for. "Is that so? Well, that's a significant responsibility for someone who, well, considering the Grayson project." "That's actually why I'm here," I said, reaching into my jacket and pulling out a slim, high-capacity flash drive. "I thought you might appreciate a look at the actual Grayson logs, the ones that show the server room access times and the original drafting stamps. It turns out the procedural uncertainty was quite certain once you look at the digital signatures Ethan Brooks used when he thought no one was watching. I've already sent the full report to the licensing board, but I felt professional courtesy dictated you see it before they contact the firm." I handed him the drive. He took it as if it were a hot coal. The two partners beside him leaned in, their faces shifting from polite boredom to sharp, professional alarm. At that moment, I saw Caleb Morris scurrying toward us. He looked like he wanted to vanish into the floor. He saw the drive in Henderson's hand and stopped short, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Caleb," I said, nodding toward him. "I was just telling the partners how helpful you've been in clarifying the timeline of the Grayson errors. Your name is all over the logs as a witness to the file modifications." Caleb's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at Henderson, then at me, then turned and walked rapidly in the opposite direction, nearly colliding with a waiter. I turned my back on the partners and walked toward the center of the room, where Ethan had finally regained enough mobility to intercept me. He met me near the stage, his face a mask of controlled fury. "What are you doing here, Lucas?" he hissed. "I told you to stay away. I have security on the way." "I'm a guest, Ethan, and I'm just here to see the show," I said. I stepped closer, entering that tight circle of proximity that forces a man to choose between retreating or escalating. "The partners have the drive. The board has the emails. Your father's influence doesn't cover fraud, especially when it's documented on a firm-wide server." "You're lying," he whispered, but his eyes were darting toward the VIP lounge, where Henderson was already gesturing sharply to a security officer. Not to remove me, but to bring him a laptop. "You have nothing. You're a disgruntled ex-employee." "Check your phone, Ethan," I suggested. "I imagine your father has just received a very interesting email regarding the kickbacks you promised the subcontractors. I believe it was sent to his office 5 minutes ago." Ethan reached for his pocket, his hand shaking so violently he almost dropped his device. I didn't stay to watch him read it. I had one more stop to make. I walked toward the back of the atrium, toward the service doors that led to the kitchen. I didn't have to go inside. Paula was already coming out, her white chef's coat stained with something red, likely the sauce she was having to prepare by hand because her industrial mixers were behind a locked steel door. She saw me and stopped, her chest heaving. She looked older than she had 3 weeks ago. The image of the composed, successful business owner was fraying at the seams. "You," she said, her voice a low, vibrating growl. "You ruined the lunch yesterday. I had to rent equipment from a competitor. Do you have any idea what that cost me? The embarrassment?" "I know exactly what it cost you, Paula," I said. I walked toward her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to shrink. I didn't feel the need to apologize for my existence. "It cost you the illusion of control. You coordinated with Ethan to have me fired so you could keep me in that house. You wanted me small so you could feel big. You stole my credit to fund your vanity, and you lied to everyone we know to make yourself the martyr." "I did everything for you," she snapped, her voice rising, drawing the attention of the nearby guests. "I kept a roof over your head when you were a failure. I protected your reputation by telling people you were sick instead of incompetent." "You didn't protect me?" I said, my voice remaining low and rhythmic, a sharp contrast to her escalating volume. "You tried to consume me, but here's the twist, Paula. I'm not incompetent. I'm a very good architect. And the first thing you learn in architecture is how to identify a structure that's built on a lie. You chose to believe Ethan's lie because it benefited your image. You traded your son for a better story to tell at the club." "I'm your mother," she cried out, her face contorting. She lunged forward, her hand raised as if to strike me, or perhaps just to grab my lapel and pull me back into her orbit. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my hands to defend myself. I simply stood there, an unmoving pillar of reality. She stopped inches from me, her hand trembling in the air. She looked into my eyes and saw nothing. No anger, no hurt, no recognition. I had become a stranger to her, a man she could no longer reach with guilt or threats. The silence between us was deafening. Around us, the party continued, but the circle of space we occupied felt like a vacuum. "The bank called me today," I said quietly. "I've filed the fraud report. They'll be contacting you on Monday about the line of credit, and the catering board has the records of the storage unit lease. You're finished here, Paula, not because of me, but because you built a house with no foundation. I'm just the one who pointed it out." She let out a sharp, choked sound and lunged again, this time an emotional collapse rather than a physical one, her hands grasping at the air as she began to sob, not with grief, but with the frustrated rage of a person who has lost their audience. I didn't respond. I didn't offer a hand or a word of comfort. I simply turned and walked toward the exit. As I passed the center of the room, I saw Henderson and the other partners standing in a tight circle around a laptop. Ethan was being escorted toward a side exit by 2 security guards, his face a pale mask of ruin. Caleb was gone, likely already in his car, trying to figure out how to explain his silence to the board. I walked out the front doors of the grand atrium. The night air was cold and sharp, filling my lungs with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I didn't look back at the glass walls or the lights. I didn't think about the aftermath or the legal battles that would surely follow. I didn't think about healing or redemption. I walked to the edge of the plaza and looked at the city skyline. I saw the cranes over the new library project, their skeletal frames reaching into the dark. I felt the weight of the keys in my pocket and the steady beat of my own heart. The structure was gone. The site was clear. I started walking toward my studio, my footsteps echoing on the pavement in a steady, deliberate rhythm. I had delivered the final line. The weight had landed. There was nothing left to say. The morning after the gala, the city felt like a fresh blueprint. Sharp lines, high contrast, and no wasted space. I was at my desk at Jenkins & Associates by 6 a.m. I didn't check the news, and I didn't check my personal messages. I spent 4 hours detailing the drainage system for the library's east courtyard. In architecture, if you don't manage the runoff, the water eventually finds a way to undermine the most beautiful structure in the world. I was making sure my work was watertight. The first physical consequence of the previous night landed at 10 o'clock. A courier arrived with a packet from Miller & Associates. It wasn't a lawsuit, it was a surrender. The firm had issued a formal retraction of my termination reason, replacing it with an administrative error correction. They also included a non-disclosure agreement and a settlement offer, a significant sum to ensure I didn't take the Grayson server logs to the press. I read the document twice, then put it through the shredder. I didn't want their money. I wanted the record to stay exactly as it was, public, messy, and undeniable. At noon, I drove to the storage facility. I knew Paula would be there. I could see her van parked haphazardly across 2 spaces near the entrance. She was standing by the unit, her hands pressed against the corrugated metal door as if she could pull it open with sheer desperation. She was wearing the same clothes from the night before, her white chef's coat now wrinkled and grayed at the cuffs. She looked like a ghost of the woman who had stood in my kitchen and told me to leave. "Open it," she said as I stepped out of my car. Her voice was hoarse, stripped of its musicality. "I have a contract for a corporate banquet tonight. If I don't get those ovens, I'll lose the deposit. I'll be sued for breach of contract." "The lease is in my name, Paula," I said, walking toward her. I didn't stop until I was standing directly in front of the door. The equipment inside was purchased with funds from the joint account, funds that were drawn against a line of credit I never authorized. Technically, these assets are under investigation. I've already spoken to the bank's recovery department. They'll be here at 2 to inventory the contents. "You can't do this," she whispered, her eyes wide and bloodshot. "I'm your mother. I gave you everything. I built that business so you would have something to inherit." "You built that business so you would have a throne," I corrected her. "And you used my name as the timber to keep the fire going. You didn't give me a life. You gave me a debt I never asked for. Now, the bill is due." She lunged at me then, not with a strike, but with a frantic, clawing motion, trying to reach for the keys I held in my hand. I stepped back, a simple, controlled movement that left her stumbling against the metal door. The sound of her palms hitting the steel echoed through the narrow corridor of units. It was a hollow, industrial sound. "I'm calling the police," she screamed, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "Go ahead," I said, leaning against the unit opposite hers. "Tell them your son is standing on property he legally leases. Tell them you'd like to discuss the signature on the bank documents from 3 years ago. I'm sure they'd love to hear your side of the story." She froze. The realization finally sank in that the walls were not just closing in. They had already met. She sank to her knees on the asphalt, her head resting against the cold metal of the door. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel a pang of regret. I felt the same neutrality I felt when a site was cleared of debris. It was just an empty lot now. I left her there and drove to the Miller and Associates office. I didn't go to the lobby. I went to the parking garage. I knew Ethan's schedule. He was a creature of habit, and today was the day he usually met with the City Planning Commission. I saw him walking toward his SUV, his head down, his shoulders hunched. He wasn't the golden boy anymore, or he was a man who had been caught moving the decimal points. He saw me and stopped, his hand freezing on the door handle. He looked around the garage, hoping for a witness, a friend, an ally, but the garage was empty. "What do you want, Reed?" he asked, his voice shaking. "The firm is paying you out. Just take the money and go." "I shredded the check, Ethan," I said, walking toward him. I didn't rush. I moved with a slow, predatory confidence. I stopped when I was inches from him, forcing him to back up against the side of his expensive vehicle. "I'm not here for money. I'm here to make sure you understand the math." "I don't know what you're talking about." "The Grayson Project," I said, my voice low and resonant in the concrete echoes of the garage. "You thought you could shift the weight of your own incompetence onto me because you had a father with a title and a mother who was willing to help you play the part. You thought the structure would hold because it looked good on paper. But you forgot about the stresses. You forgot that if you push a man long enough, he stops being a person and starts being a force of nature." "I'll have you arrested for harassment," he spat, though his eyes were darting toward the exit. "No, you won't," I said. "Because if you do, the discovery process will include every email you've sent for the last 5 years. It will include the logs of every time you logged into my terminal. It will include the testimony of Caleb Morris, who is currently in Henderson's office trying to trade your head for his own career. You're not the one making the rules anymore, Ethan. You're just the one standing under the falling debris." I reached out and tapped the window of his SUV. "Nice car. I wonder if the bank will let you keep it once the professional liability suits start rolling in. I imagine the firm is going to sue you for every cent of that Grayson contract." Ethan's face went white. He tried to speak, but he only made a soft, wheezing sound. I turned and walked away, my footsteps sharp and rhythmic on the concrete. I didn't look back to see him crumble into the driver's seat. I didn't need to. I knew the structural integrity of his life was at 0. The final stop was a small park near the city center. Caleb Morris was sitting on a bench, a cardboard coffee cup in his hand. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. He looked up as I approached, his expression one of exhaustion rather than fear. "I told them everything, Lucas," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I gave them the logs. I gave them the timestamps. They're firing Ethan this afternoon. They're letting me stay on as a junior, but I'm on probation. My career is basically a flat line." "You chose the silence, Caleb," I said, standing over him. "You watched them take my life apart, and you didn't say a word because you wanted to stay in the shade. Now you have to live in the cold." "I'm sorry," he said. I don't care, I replied. Apologies are just words. I'm an architect. I care about what stands. And right now, nothing you've built is standing. I walked away from him, leaving him on the bench. I felt a profound sense of completion. The revenge wasn't a sudden explosion. It was the final, inevitable collapse of a poorly designed system. I had merely accelerated the process by removing the lies that were acting as the temporary shoring. I returned to my studio as the sun began to set. I sat on my cot and looked at the notebook on my desk. I picked up a pen and drew a single, heavy line through the names. Paula, Ethan, Caleb. The list was done. The project was closed. I looked at the walls of my room. They were bare, clean, and solid. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel healed. I just felt the weight of the truth, heavy and immovable. I had destroyed the idea of the control they had over me. I had reclaimed the coordinates of my own life. I stood up and went to the window. Below me, the city was a grid of lights and shadows, a complex machine that required constant maintenance and honesty to function. I saw the cranes in the distance, still working on the library. Tomorrow, I would go back there. I would check the reinforcements. I would verify the loads. I would build something that was meant to last. I reached for the light switch and paused. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the need to look over my shoulder. I didn't feel the phantom pressure of Paula's expectations or Ethan's malice. I was just a man in a room. I clicked the light off. The darkness was absolute, quiet, and perfectly structural. The revenge was over. The building was down.